Welcome to the depth of the authentic. Boom. I'm exhausted. As I was mentioning in previous videos, I'm going through a rough times. This is probably also the last video that I'm going to do in this setting. I'm moving out from this place, which thanks God, because it was not too vital for me and for my mental health. But we are here today. Yay! So what are we doing here today? We're here to talk about my, again, favorite topic, persistent traumas. Whoa, 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 whoa! Well, persistent traumas is a term that I mentioned before in previous videos, and as I have said, I am here willing to expand and explain and discourse about it and why it is so significant, especially in such a hyper-normalized times, for real. And I really just want people to heal, okay? So, before going to start, I want to put a pushpin here, okay? Because trauma is a term that unfortunately been abused and weaponized like all the time by young people, by adults, by therapists, by psychiatrists, but a lot of people, like just random people. And what I'm trying to do here is to take ownership of how this term works now. Yeah, understanding the history of it, understanding possibly the future, the potential future of it. You remember potential future, not potential history, aka Ariela Azulay. Ariela Aisha Azulay. Well, I know her before she changed her name. But this is not a topic. Again, I'm very flowing with the extensions that my brain is activating. So before we will dive in, I want us to stay attuned to the vital accommodation that needs to be done once we use this term, because, you know, it was weaponized. It is weaponized. So let's start and take this topic like with the most accurate and understand the perspective and the historical perspective of it. So I will start. Shimmy, shimmy. Whew, okay. So persistent trauma is a term that coined by Dr. Effi Ziv, and it is a conceptual extension and expansion of the diagnosis category of CPTSD. Now, this term reframes trauma not as a singular event, or not even just as a acute event, but as a post-adipal attachment, a psychic response to prolonged socio-political and cultural disasters and oppressions. Like, I know. Well, persistent traumas are basically gender. Gender is a persistent trauma. Misogyny is coincidentally comes from gender. And every psychic response to this binarity and just the discourse on gender creates oppression. Also racism, racial and nationalism, for example. Racism and nationalism are both persistent traumas, for example. Each one of them are still persists, and they are sociopolitical, and they're cultural, and they're economical. Of course, anti-Semitism, classicism, religious coercion, etc., etc. Those namings and categories just define persistent trauma, as we can understand, and I will explain later, like moral trauma. Those categories are within this umbrella of persistent trauma. And if we take a step back to understand this perspective, we can understand with its variable performances, persistent trauma is responsible for a big chunk of depressive assimilation that exists in reality. Okay? Everyone speak about it in variable terms, but here it's very, very the quality over the quantity. Okay? It's a very, very minimalistic term. This is why I love it, because it's not that common to meet such accurate and minimalistic terms that not only respond like mental or like the evolutionary epigenetic of our sides and evolution living with PTSD and traumas, but also the sociological and cultural aspects of it. And persistent trauma emerges from this intersection of the medical discourse and critical theory, which eventually, consequently, manifests its quality and accuracy. It operates rhizomatically, and I will explain about the rhizomatic philosophy shortly. And it politicizes the hegemonic sovereign language of trauma diagnosis, okay? Which is very, very embodied critically. It's not obvious at all that someone from within the institution will try to divorce the sovereign language of this diagnostic into the sociocultural aspects of it. Doing this kind of separation allows us not only to see the persistent trauma within the discourses of the diagnostic discourses and the medical and law discourses, but also in the cultural aspects of how trauma is seen, perceived, and discussed. And these traumas are densified. They're layered and layered, and they define our bodies, our minds, our mentality, often resulting in intergenerational trauma and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I'm going to dive in very quickly about the fact that despite this work of that of the authentic is my work for I think 7 years now, it's been obvious to me that trauma creates changes in the brain. And it's not obvious to me only, okay? It's become more and more even researched how trauma changed the paths in the brain and therefore changed some genes in these epigenetic paths Therefore, intergenerational trauma can affect many generations after the trauma has happened. And this is why it's persistent, because it's changed and modified our brain and genes, and now it's reenacted daily through different signals and significations. And once those, we are living in an excess world, we get more and more, we see more and more, we sense with our senses more and more and more forms of persistent trauma, whether it's with the radicalization of countries and the political disasters that is going on, or just poverty and the gap between classes, or the gender problem that is a problem because it is oppressing human bodies and souls and create a lot of trauma, and it's thickening. It's all getting thick and more layers of persistent trauma employ on our bodies, on our minds. It comes from our parents, from our teachers, from our bank accounts, from everyone, because everyone carries the debt of the authentic. And if they carry, everyone, the debt of the authentic, they also have to unlearn the persistent trauma that they carry. This is what I'm trying to do. It's not easy. If you would know how many times I had eager discourse with my therapist about their own persistent traumas and how I don't want this to be a transference like in my therapy. It was not easy discourse. But it is important, because if we want to find resolution to things like classicism and nationalism and like racial and neo-fascism, all those kind of stuff that we are all not in favor of, we have to see, recognize, and learn what do we do once we understand the form and the performance of this persistent trauma. Okay, so I'm going to go back a bit and remind of the rhizomatic model of the trauma, which is unlike the hierarchical model and the authoritative model that frames trauma as a rupture in an otherwise normal reality. Okay, this is like, if you go back to the diagnosis and how trauma has been formed in the culture or in the psychiatric, discourses, you would find that this hierarchical mode always comes in relation to the normal reality. Therefore, it creates a singular and linear or binary perception on trauma. And even with Judith Herman and Lacan and all of those, there are oppressive humiliations that those people have had despite their good will, but it's seen in their text. So if we want to dismantle the perception and this binary perception, we need to employ a rhizomatic model that views trauma as a web, as a texture, as a texture that rhizomatically, simultaneously thickening around us, in between us, and creates social injuries. And this approach challenges binary distinction between the past and present and abnormal and or normal, those kind of binary modes that exist and still, activate the psychological discourse and the therapeutical discourse and even just the cultural discourse. But we must really, in order to understand how trauma works, we must stop activating ourselves. We have to take slow, like the heel slower, and move slower and look wider and see the connections and this texture of web that actually is the trauma and how it operates. It cannot be a singular event. It's not tabula rasa, like nothing happened before. And this is actually not like in correlation to last research of epigenetics and how trauma passes intergenerationally. So this is one of the views and gazes that needs to be employed if we want to understand and see how persistent trauma works. And also understanding, like this is the second section, there is no terrible non-extremity to the event. Let's be more accurate. While hegemonic definitions emphasize on the extremity and deviation of the event from the norm, persistent trauma reframes the normal conditions themselves, okay? Which means the extremity of the traumatic event does not come in relation to a normative condition, not at all. And this is why it works so well in synchronicity and simultaneously with hypernormalization term. I think they were both on 20, like around, I think hypernormalization was in 2007 and this was like in 2012. Don't catch me on that. But what Effi Ziv is trying to explain about this kind of conditions is that extreme events of trauma only occurs when the normal disguises the oppressions of the symptoms very covertly. It's not like it's translucid, okay? And they render, like this normal renders this kind of traumas, this extremity. It's not extremity, like rape is something that happens every day, nothing extreme about it. Also authoritative abuse, it's literally happen every minute, every second, like capitalism and abuse of relationships and misconduct, and like this is the reality. And even in law enforcement, like we are all have seen there is no such thing justice, and that people who work on those like in the government or in law enforcement are people who are actually oppressing the middle class and the poor to help the richer and the privileged to maintain their status. So unless those law enforcement people does not have persistent trauma, this does not make any sense, okay? They have to have a trauma. They have to have a persistent trauma. Otherwise, they would not perform these kind of actions. And it highlights how normative persistent trauma is. Sadly. Very sadly. But we have to name them. And we have to name that this is not a normal reality, it's in hypernormalization. So, persistent trauma is often characterized by symbolic domination that leaves no visibility or marks. Okay? And I am sorry to say, but CPTSD and PTSD are visible. This is why I called it transparent videos in my previous video. Like, this no visible marks, like, creates a phantom effect that operates through internalized mechanisms of shame, guilt, and self-reduction rather than overt fear or terror. And this is how the phantom effect works. When so many humankinds just internalized, whether it's shame, guilt, and self-reduction, those internalizations are depressive assimilations of the persistent trauma. We are, as children and as infants, as adults, we meet persistent trauma and we internalize it, and this is why there is so much mental problems today and so much guilt and shame and somatic based disorders, okay? And what creates understanding persistent traumas and transparent disabilities is understand that the success, okay, if we're thinking of successful, we all want successfulness. This success lies with the fact that it is transparent, it is covered, it is underneath the skin, so we can barely feel it, but we know it's there. And shame, guilt, all of those emotions are something very common. Therefore, persistent trauma is very common. Like, we, as a humankind, all those feelings are supposed to be vital for our mental and body and somatic experiences. Nonetheless, with modernism and the way that the media, internet, and capitalism has changed the world, this phantom effect is getting more and more quantity. And I don't think we should displace it as much as we do, because it's not seems to be too vital. Like, I would guess that dealing with those emotions and understanding that they are emotions that meant to show us something, but also understanding that our actions, our words are activated from those emotions, can also talk about this phantom effect. But what I'm trying to explain is that in order to understand how trauma works, PTSD and complex post-trauma and persistent traumas, and how it's been internalized, we have to admit that all those performances of shame, guilt, anger, and all those displacements that has lost touch with the essence, the hakacity, as they call it in philosophy, Well, I want to note, like, this term, it's like brackets. This term is so incredible because it responds to millions of thousands of questions and thoughts that were in the critical discourse. It really responds to it by naming this term, like in Fanon books, and like he always talk, like I feel like that she finds a term that describes what Fanon was talking about. He was talking about the way he is perceived and his, white skin, black mask. I don't know if this is the accurate name of the book. Again, don't count me on that. But in this book, he's like questioning all of those performances and tries to understand this interrelational performances and what it actually performs, what the actions and the words that are named in this space and texture. And by doing this, creating this perspective on trauma, is actually dismantles the way it was perceived before, and also create so much potentiality for understanding and empathizing within groups, within communities, within our fellow humankinds, and understanding the complexities and this in between, and how hard it is to grasp it, even if we can feel it. Okay? Okay, so the unlanguage conditions of processing the traumatic event and realities, because it's the reality, it's the normal reality, right? Like, currently, there is a lack of linguistic infrastructure to articulate ongoing harm, results in emotional disintegration. Like, this is, again, I'm going back to Fanon. This inability to integrate somatic and linguistic experience, somatic, the way our body showing and talking to us, okay, and tells us how we feel and how we think and all of that, or what we have, and the linguistics, the way we communicate, perceive, activate language and translations, okay? There is now this failure of witnessing, okay? Transform pain into trauma. Now, let's explain this. Now, I want to go back something here because I have written something that I need to find it. Yeah, I just remembered. I think she was borrowing it from Robert Stolrow. I think I'm saying its name. That trauma, like pain, eventually like thickens and this was my washing machine. Okay, so I'm going back and I am remembering that she was borrowing this unlanguage condition from Robert Stolrow. I think this is how they name their names. I don't know. And also the problem that has no name, where eventually those kind of invisible or transparent reality and creates a witnessness. We as human witness this transparency on abnormality, all of this. So there is unlanguage that is happening. There is not enough tools and somatic or linguistic tools to transform this pain into something other than trauma. Therefore, I'm going to speak about moral trauma. Moral trauma is a form of persistent trauma. Moral trauma, even emphasis how pain, when it is not navigated, or guilt or shame, you know, all of those catastrophical emotions, that it is hard due to the naturalization of the modern life and the domestication of humankind. There is no much other options and tools for the humankind soul to digest the pain or those emotions and to eventually render them into trauma. And this is moral trauma, and it is prevalent form of persistent trauma, because we witness everything today. We literally witness all the things, everything. We're at times where we have wars and rapes and sexual assault on live broadcasts, okay? So we witness everything, and this moral trauma refers to the deep psychological, behavioral, and social, and even spiritual consequences of exposure to events that violates their own subject, the individual core moral beliefs and ethical expectations. Let's say I am a person who on the 7th of October just by chance opened the Telegram, and I was witnessing all of those war live. Or let's say when the war with Ukraine and Russia was happening, I was like on live on Telegram seeing what's going on. Or let's say we're at the bar, someone's grabbing someone's ass. We saw that, we witnessed. And more and more and more and more. We don't necessarily choose, we just witness with our senses, okay? Even watching sometimes like an ad can do this, can create this violation of our moral stance. Because if someone sells us, I don't know, let's say Kylie Jenner meta glasses, like the video that I was creating, we are like, oh, she's so sexy, aka pornographic, but okay, fine. At the same time, we know that these glasses are used to videograph women without their consent, okay, for pornographic ways. Like all those kind of stuff that are very normal, super normal. Like even, let's say, when I was doing my BFA, the students who were in my class, I shared with them, like, I got sexually harassed by this professor. They witnessed, maybe not first sight, but they witnessed through their ears that I had experienced sexual harassment from the professor. We're all witnessing those kind of things all the time. And the psychic wound of moral trauma stems out from actions taken, but also from the act of witnessing. Okay? The act of witnessing itself is enough through the mental and to our brain. Okay? It's just enough. And it disrupts, okay, the subject's, the individual ethical orientation to the world. It really is. It's like glitches. And it often accompanied with effective responses such as guilt, shame, disgust, and rage, and more. Anger, you know, we're humankind have plenty of emotions. Each signifies, of course, the fractured alignment between internal and moral codes and to the surrounding reality. How much it is hard for us to witness and feel those emotions, bear with those emotions. At the same time, the reality continues, it persists. It's not like the Palestinians people has ever, the Nakba has never stopped, okay? Like, it never stopped. So, I, for example, suffer from moral injury, like being in Israel. It's kind of resistant trauma. I tried to immigrate many times, but being an Israeli immigrator is fucking hard, okay? So, what do you do? What do you do in those kind of situations? I'm in a moral standpoint that is excruciating for me, and I'm trying to do whatever I can, to survive and understand the interrelational aspect and this texture of persistent trauma. Now, moral trauma thus may be viewed as a crisis of ethical subjectivity. Like, it can be entangled with socio-political structures and failures and of collective accountability. Let's say the right wing, the Nazis in the United States, like, what's going on? There's some very, very people, I can see that they are sick. Like, it's not something that is, like, you can also see that. But because they present such ethical entanglement within the socio-political views, like, it creates failures of accountability and collective accountability. And again, those are all significations for the death of the authentic, because the death of the authentic inhibits a lot of things. It inhibits the accommodations and the assimilations and the hypernormalizations and the persistent traumas. It's like the bigger umbrella, okay? So within the framework of persistent trauma and post-Oedipal discourse, brackets, the discourse that we decided, accordingly to Effi Ziv, decide to call post-Oedipal because the shift that Freud has made, despite the fact that he was creating one of the influential texts in the whole history, he shifted the seduction theory, which was about real events, into the Oedipal theory, which is about fantasy. And therefore, it got accepted that the post-Oedipal discourse is about shifting reality into a fantasy that is not real. It does not resolve what the reality is, and it extends and creates access of fantasies. So, end of brackets. Moral traumas reflect the psychic costs of maintaining the ethical agency in these times. Like, how hard it is. Even like buying a cup of coffee caused environmental crisis. So what do we do? Like, this environments and realities is saturated with violence, complexity, and systematic coercions. Okay? What do we do? It's literally against our moral agency. So, first we need to understand that this is a trauma. It's a trauma response. It's not necessarily the vital response, it's a trauma response, and to understand what it does to our brain. And unless we do that, those traumas, persistent traumas and moral traumas, enables the individuals to commit, omit, or witness action that conflict with their internal moral compasses, and sometimes consequently act against their own values due to lack of tools, understanding, or ability understanding their own trauma. But it is offer often referred like within commission or omission. Conversely, they fail to align with their own values. This is like a loop, a very, very harsh loop of trauma. And there is like, it's all about testimonies. And what does it mean? It's your word against mine. There is no accountability of being alive alongside other people, other humankind. And the reason why persistent trauma, this umbrella, is so brilliant, because if we validate that ourselves, we don't need to get validation from anywhere else just because our parents didn't validate us enough or to validate us, whatever. Those are all sorts of persistent trauma. We need to do a format to our brains in order to see the new paths that persistent traumas has created. And as I'm trying to collect everything that I said and to feel this texture, I feel it, I understand, and I see it thickens and layered up more and more and coming from different places and spaces and times and temporalities. But it still happens, still persists. The normal still diluted with persistent traumas. This is why it's hypernormal. And when I speak with people who I find, not from my gaze, not from my perspective, people who are like extremely nationalist, extremely religious, extremely, gender radical, whatever space that is, okay? I see trauma. I don't see necessarily that these people are these nationalist people in Israel or in the United States or in Europe or in Russia or in Africa. They're terrible people. They're the worst. We should kill them all. No. They need to be rehabilitated because they're ill. Something has been fixated and shifted and displaced. And I don't know, so thick, so textured within their body, their mind, and sadly, the actions are violence. So I'm going to speak about the violence actions that the traumatic people are creating. I know, if I'm going to bring this last final example, which I will probably speak up more about, racism, right? In United States, it's super hot topic. How hard was this for United States to admit that Michael Jackson is legit a pedophile? O.J. Simpson is legit a murderer. But these persistent traumas of becoming and being the racist or the black and white, it comes together, which means that it was too hard for those people to understand that someone who came from such an underrepresented group has been in the most powerful and authoritative and economical class, okay? Persistent traumas. And they abused their power to create violent crimes. How hard was this to even admit it? And it's not taken, there is no taken by the fact that they are suffer themselves. Gucci, the cat. They themselves suffer from persistent trauma because they suffer from racism and misogyny. So when you build those things layer, you create sculptures. And maybe, if you would want, I can show and share some of the sculptures that I make in relation to this philosophy that are inhibited those kind of discourse that I'm trying to move and dance with you. So, bye-bye. Bye-bye. I'm going to see you probably in a different settings. Who knows when it will be the final setting. But again, I'm poor. I have so much persistent traumas that I'm like, adjust, accommodate, be vital, accommodate to this setting. Yalla. Bye.